It was a beautifully bright and crisp morning on the island of Sodor, and Thomas the Tank Engine was working hard on his branch line, harder than usual. With the usual suspects of Annie and Clarabel faithfully following along behind, Thomas also had an array of vans that he had to take up and down the line. The vans were fully loaded with tools and supplies that the stations needed to help cope with the snowy weather, which was getting thicker by the day, causing Thomas to wear his snowplow. Annie and Clarabel didn't like the winter at the best of times, and with Thomas moaning about the snowplow, the journey up and down his branch line was less and less enjoyable for passengers. Some began to complain.
They said what?
Thomas snorted indignantly. The passengers have said that you're too angry, Thomas, especially for this time of year, his driver explained. Thomas was even more furious.
If they don't like my attitude, then they can jolly well take Bertie the bus,
the little blue engine snapped.
I don't like my snowplow. It's heavy and uncomfortable.
Thomas, his driver began, but Thomas wheezed steam at him and his driver gave up reasoning with him. That night, the snowfall had been increasingly heavier than the nights previous. The shed doors were open for Thomas, but he rolled his eyes.
Great! Just great!
He set to work. He collected Annie and Clarabel and arranged his vans. Thomas had begun pondering what his driver had said. With Christmas round the corner, he could have been slightly more festive, but Thomas, stubborn as he was, carried on the same. The more stubborn and grumpy he was, the more frosty reception he received from everyone and anyone.
Get in quickly,
Thomas snapped as they pulled into Hackenbach. The passengers were shocked by Thomas's tone of voice and the way he'd phrased his request. They did as he said, but muttered amongst themselves as Thomas prepared to leave with his train.
I don't think that was called for,
Annie said.
I do, Thomas grunted. After they complained about me, they don't deserve any better.
Annie and Clarabel were stunned. Thomas had never been like this before. They had lightened up through the festive period, but Thomas wasn't being cooperative. The guard broke the icy silence with his shrill whistle, his flag cutting the tension as he signalled Thomas the rebellious engine on his way. The more Thomas continued his behaviour, the more isolated he became. Soon enough, his driver had made a decision.
I've had it, he snapped. I've had it.
He jumped down from the footplate with a wrench in one hand. He marched round to the front of Thomas and began undoing the snowplow.
What are you doing?
Thomas sniffed. I'm taking this off, so then you aren't so stroppy and rude, Thomas. The passengers are nervous and they don't know what you're going to do next. You've never been like this before. As the snowplow was lifted off from Thomas's front end, Thomas began to feel happier already. Now Thomas knows that he needed his snowplow, but because he had his own way, he simply didn't care. Thomas set off and collected his train.
Ready for the day?
Thomas said brightly to his two coaches. Annie and Clarabel were both shocked by this new change of heart from their friend and replied, Yes, Thomas.
Right then,
he said. The blue tank engine snorted away with his coaches and supply wagons rumbling along behind him. As he pulled into the first station, he saw passengers all lined up on the platform. He whistled gaily with a smile across his face.
Good morning,
he cheerfully called. The passengers didn't say much. They looked Thomas up and down and slowly took their places in his two coaches. Right away, called the guard. And their journey began. Thomas snorted out front, cheerful but lacking a snowplow. He was making good time, he had a good head of steam and was running well.
See, I don't need it,
said the cheeky engine. Meanwhile, up ahead, Bertie had gone over the tunnel. He was late and was trying to make up for lost time, revving his engine and maintaining grip. I'll do it, Bertie said to himself. Keep it up, old boy, his driver said. At last, Bertie the bus reached the top. The passengers cheered, and Bertie let out a loud toot on his horn. Snow or no snow, that hill wasn't going to beat me, he rumbled down the other side. The loud noise had made a lot of compact snow fall on the line, making a drift. Just then, Thomas entered the tunnel. He was very pleased until...
Not again!
Thomas groaned as he steadily slumped into the snowdrift. He stopped with a jolt. His driver tried to make Thomas go back, but the snow, as compact as it was, stopped Thomas. It was freezing this particular morning, so Thomas's nose began to go as blue as his paintwork.
"How are we going to get him out?" asked the driver.
"Got it," said the fireman. He went along the train asking anyone who could get out and come to the van at the back of the train. In the van was some shovels. He told every person who was able to pick up a shovel and go to Thomas. The passengers weren't sure.
"Does Thomas deserve it?"
they said.
"He's been rude all week,"
they said. "Thomas, the snow engine," they said.
"The train will have to stay where it is then.
We can't clear it on our own. Besides, do two wrongs make a right?" the fireman said. The passengers were sorry at once, and all the volunteers got their shovels from the van, and with the hot coals from Thomas's firebox, they began to melt the snow and shovel it away. It wasn't too long till Thomas, cold and stiff, was free.
Thank you,"
Thomas shivered.
"And I'm sorry, I just hate that snowplow."
The passengers understood, but asked Thomas to be more considerate in the future, which he agreed he would be. "You look like you have frostbite, Thomas, especially with that blue nose," said his driver. Everyone laughed and climbed back aboard the train. Thomas, who was a much happier engine, set off, learning that if you're in a bad situation, don't make it worse for yourself. Not like Thomas.